welcome to the Roadmap to Recovery 2021 report and panel. This is a release for us, and we have, we're going to today hear from Ashley Shelton, our founder, president, and CEO of the Power Coalition, about what this roadmap is, how it's the second edition, and then we're joined by a panel of folks that we have deep partnerships that can really talk to the nuances of the roadmap. So today we'll go through the roadmap, show you everything that is in it and how it can be used as a tool towards equity and justice. And we'll also take a deep dive into some of the things that are there. We want this roadmap to be a living document. This is our second edition of it. And so we're gonna make sure that we get a critical mass of people on, and then we will turn it to Ashley to kind of open us up. We're really appreciative of you all being here and so excited to release this roadmap that we did in deep partnership with community leaders and folks across the state. And before, as we're getting a critical mass, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you all so you can see where the roadmap is on the Power Coalition page. We have a virtual option on our page that you all can see. So I'm going to do that right now as we're waiting for folks to join. We had a lot of RSVPs, and this information is not only timely, but it's deep. And it really does show you the pathway towards equity and justice. So we want to make sure everybody hears this. But I appreciate you all for being on the line with us this Wednesday morning. And so if you go to powercoalition.org, you'll see a lot of stuff, but right there on the homepage on the side, you'll be able to click the 2021 Roadmap to Recovery. And then it'll take you to what the roadmap is, a little synopsis of it, and those kinds of things. You can view the full report to the roadmap, and you can see the executive summary, you can download. And we also have a place for you to take action, because we don't want this to just be a document that's pretty with a lot of colors that sits on your shelf. We want you to be able to take action. And so through our one click, you'll be able to take action and really talk to your elected officials at every level and say, we want a people-centered recovery, and this is the road to it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, let's get started. Ashley, I'm going to turn it to you. We'll be sharing your slides when you tell us to put them up. And just give us this, like, why are we doing this for the second time, and what this is.
Yes, well, good morning. It's so good to be here today with many of the Power Coalition friends and family, and kind of share with you this, second edition of the roadmap to recovery. And so, like for us, this roadmap was looking at, once again, we knew COVID and the pandemic certainly had a disaster scale of impact and effect on not only Louisiana, but most of the country and the world. And so we knew that in order to respond and recover our communities, that it was going to take resources from the federal government to do that. And so we've received, resources from the previous president, and then most recently have received dollars from Biden for, that we've been calling ARPA dollars, and those ARPA dollars are here. And, what we wanted to do was use this document as an opportunity to stoke some imagination. I think that what we find when these dollars come into our communities is that, and what we know is that some of them are used to plug budget holes. Some of it's seen as surplus money. And what we know it isn't for our communities and folks in community is that it isn't actually surplus dollars. It's actually critical care and need in terms of addressing the housing issues, addressing other issues that we'll show you as we kind of jump into the report. And so if we want to go on and jump into the slides, I can do that. And then I'll introduce our panel and we can kind of jump into some discussion.
Okay, pulling the slides up right now. 1 second. Share. All right, Ashley.
All right. Yeah, let's go. Let's go to the second slide and we can get started. So I'm happy, to be here with you again today. Power Coalition is a coalition of organizations that are base builders and that are working deeply in community to understand how to use their voice and take action. And, we believe that your vote is your voice, is your power. And that this document is representative of so many of the conversations that we've been having in community, but certainly with our partners who are here with us today and our partners in this work on an ongoing basis. Next slide. And so, a couple of things about the roadmap before we kind of get into all the slides. I mean, I think we wanted to look at this from kind of every issue area, but actually the interesting thing about the report itself is that, this is a data-driven report that's looking at the resources that are coming into our state, specifically, through ARPA funds. This is the second edition of this that we've done. This edition kind of specifically focuses on this, this last tranche of resources that we received. And, the goal is for, this document to, like I said, stoke some imagination and be a goalpost for, equity and inclusion. And what does it mean to actually center people in the recovery? And that I also feel like it is a must that we center people in this recovery, because I also, I think what folks keep asking me the question, like, what do you think was so different about Ida, where folks didn't want to hear the word resilient anymore? And, and I said, I think it's just the compounded, traumas of, COVID and, and this storm, where like folks have just been through a lot, and they've had a lot on them for quite some time. And so what we hope this roadmap does is, gives us an opportunity to really look at the intersections and to look at how childcare, unemployment, and, and these things actually work together, like addressing these issues, housing insecurity, food insecurity, how if we work together to address these, they have lasting impacts on our community. And so it's our hope that you can use this document for organizing and advocacy. And, during our discussion today, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to preview the roadmap on our website at www.powercoalition.org. And again, like I said, I love this graphic. We were trying to figure out, like, how do you look at intersections? And I said, a clover leaf. I was like, the clover leaf interstate patterns, like this to me kind of talked about the fact that, like, this is about housing. This is about, healthy communities and healthy people. This is about schools and infrastructure more specifically. And then this is also too about, in this moment, as we look at, crime and other things increasing, in our communities, that we also live with the reality that, some of that is born of just the sheer desperation that people find themselves in. And so how are we thinking about, mental health services and supports that don't look like criminalization, when we know our communities are just reeling from a compounding disasters? And so with that, let's jump into this report. Next slide. We focus on a couple of different, issue areas. So, certainly workers in our state, was really important for us to be able to focus, some of the energy here. We looked at unemployment. We looked at the fact that, Louisiana, is one of 5 states that doesn't have, a minimum wage, right, of our own. I mean, and so the federal policy stands, but we don't have it on the books as policy in our own state. But also too, we looked at, like, who are we centering? We know that women of color in the state of Louisiana bore the brunt of the impacts of unemployment due to COVID, and that, there was definitely opportunities for us to, for us to understand, like, how can we, how can we help and talk about like the impacts of, the hospitality industry in New Orleans being mostly, shut down in the immediacy, following the first, kind of shutdown from the storm, and then the slow recovery thereafter. And then also too about the jobs that just haven't come back. I think that there's this conversation that folks don't want to go back to work, and we've been having fights about unemployment insurance. But the reality is that, that they're just jobs that did not come back in our economy because they're businesses that didn't come back. And so I think that we've got to have a real conversation about, what are people actually facing, and what's actually driving some of the housing and food insecurity that we're seeing across our state in the aftermath of this. We also wanted to point out some of the investments that, within the ARPA funds, it allows municipalities to raise the wage of their lowest paid employees to $13 an hour. And, for like these monies are, it's a limited time that these monies will be provided. But in that time period, I think that for all of the lowest paid workers within, city governments across the state, this is an opportunity to continue to take these resources and allow communities to benefit from them in ways that they may not have otherwise. But also too, looking at the intersections of childcare, looking at like how are we training and moving people into the workforce? How are we thinking about the impacts of, of pandemics and climate change in our workforce? And then, I'll save this, but I'll make a note for Jan when we get to him about, also too, like the issues around unemployment insurance in our state. And so we have like one of the lowest payouts in the country. There was some, kind of concessions made this last regular session. And I don't think we're where we want to, we certainly aren't where we want to be. And we've got to make sure that we're doing more to, protect workers in our community. Jan, I didn't know if you were piping in. Okay. Never mind. Next to the slide, education. We also looked at education. And again, like trying to understand like what are the policy changes and opportunities, within, these ARPA funds for our students and for children in the state of Louisiana. What are the things that we recognize that are problematic? We know that, 66% of our children are, qualify for free or reduced lunch within our schools. We know that that we've got challenges too with both COVID and we've seen a lot of the news coverage around the mask mandate, which has now been extended, for 29 more days. But we know that currently the governor shared, that many of the new cases are children who are who are underaged and cannot be vaccinated, and that there are quite a few cases that include, those students. And so we've certainly got work to do. And so, and so for us, thinking about how we could use ARPA monies to do wraparound supports for social emotional leadership, mental health, and overall health in schools. I think one of the things that we learned from any disaster, in particular Katrina, was that, the thing that we missed in the midst of trying to recover communities across the impacted area was that, our children really did suffer a mental health blow from, like just the layered issues that were created by Katrina, and also too, just the death and the loss. And then the pain of trying to recover or being dispersed across the country, trying to get back home, that all of these things have impacts on our children, and that we need to be thinking about like, how are we providing those wraparound supports for our students? And then also too, how are we expanding free and reduced lunch? Disaster preparedness and relief, like this is a piece, we added it specifically because of Ida. We know that, we're in a disaster prone state. We know that we're going to have hurricanes. I think that what we are concerned about is that the season is now lasting longer, and that there are more active storms that are coming through on a regular basis every year. And so what that means is that we've got to look at some things like the Stafford Act that, kind of governs how FEMA FEMA shows up and moves in our communities after disasters. We know that we've got, there are a lot of policy changes that need to be made, that like actually help people recover and don't get folks caught up in the bureaucracy in the greatest time of need. And so, for us, we've had the opportunity to serve, hot meals in partnership with many of our partners, Vote and others. I provided ice to communities. We've also been able to provide, $200,000 in direct cash assistance, almost, within like 9 days of, the storm. We made sure that there was money in the hands of all of the groups on the ground that were providing direct cash assistance, from House of Tulips to OPPRC, to the 4 Native tribes recognized by the state of Louisiana. We were just moving resources to make sure that, folks had what they needed to be able to respond in this time. And I want to notice somebody that worked on Katrina to Ida, that, one of the things that I'm really proud of is that folks like to say, oh, there's no infrastructure, but there's a beautiful infrastructure that has been built across our state, that is able to respond, in times of need. And so it was really nice to be able to depend on that. Depend on that infrastructure to be able to move resources to people in community. Next slide. Democracy. I mean, I think one of the other, it's one of the core pieces of our work. I mean, we are a civic engagement table. We do the work of engaging and educating infrequent voters of color across the state of Louisiana. And so, this is also an important piece. And I think that also what we're recognizing is that there's a link between disaster and democracy as well. So we worked with the governor and the secretary of state to have the election moved. We had an election scheduled for October 9th. It has now been moved to November 13th. And we still have some challenges ahead of us. We still have several thousand folks without electricity. Lots of infrastructure that typically would serve as a polling location that has been destroyed, as well as typical, like the folks that would usually be our poll workers who have been directly impacted by this storm. And so, for us, we've been asking for a couple of things. Like, one, we need to work with the legislature to actually put some laws in place so that there can be an effective election administration in times of disaster, especially since the seasons are lasting longer. But that we also need to, think about what it means for, how do we send an absentee ballot to a home that's been destroyed, or to a place that's not receiving mail on time. I mean, currently, I know that that's the case in the river parishes, but like New Orleans is still not receiving mail in a timely manner. And so it makes issues around absentee ballot. And then I think the other issue is also that, folks are constructively displaced, right? Like, so folks are in Houston and Mississippi and other places. And now that folks are coming home, we still have to figure out, like, how do they get ballots? How do they exercise their voice and their vote and their power? But also from a, certainly within this report, we talk about, allowing unrestricted vote by mail, creating fair and equitable political, districts that we are about to engage in redistricting shortly here in February. And so we have there's a roadshow that's starting October 20th, where we hope that everyone will participate and have their comments heard about how maps are being drawn in their communities. I think the first one is October 20th in Monroe, and then they wrap up in Baton Rouge sometime towards the end of January, having these discussions about, how communities come together. And we encourage you to check out the suite of resources on our website at powercoalition.org. So there's Days Redistricting app, there are crowd academies where we actually do a 3-day training to teach people how to draw maps, to teach people the terminology that goes along with redistricting. But we ask you to definitely join us on that process, join us in that process and have your voice heard in redistricting, because it will determine whether you can elect candidates of choice. And it will determine, as we've seen through COVID, right? Like, that elected leaders are determining whether we have access to healthcare, whether we're safe at our jobs, whether our children are safe at schools. And so these are really important decisions that we need to make sure we're electing the leaders that are going to do what's right for our families and our communities. Next slide. the money. So as you can see, there is a lot of money coming to the state of Louisiana through the American Rescue Plan Act. And so I've been calling, we call it ARPA for short. So it's the American Rescue Plan Act funding. And so, there's about $4.8 billion that's going to be running through the state. And it's a real opportunity for us to make people whole on the other side of this, pandemic. And so you'll see, and again, I won't go really deeply into all of the numbers. I will say that for my colleague, Moeller. But yeah, the state's getting a little over 3 billion. And then it gets, broken down to, 902 million around the through the parishes, 589 million for metropolitan cities, and then municipalities with fewer than 50,000 residents. We have a lot of towns and townships and villages in Louisiana, about 315 million. So there's a lot of money that will flow through our state through the American Rescue Plan Act. Some of those dollars have already been dedicated and have, and were decided by the legislature this last session. And so now there's more money coming. And so how do we make sure that those dollars actually get into the hands of directly impacted folks and communities? Next slide. Safety net recommendations. So, I think for us, investments should be made in people. I think we see a lot of focus on business, and we are certainly, not against business. We're just saying that, the same efficiencies that we work with businesses, we should also work with community and trust community with resources. A perfect example is the child tax credit. We're seeing that, it's having a transformative impact on, many families, in times of disaster, but also not, including pandemics, right? Like that, we were able through the PPP program to really effectively and efficiently move money to community. But when it was time to actually move money to people, like we always talk about fraud and we talk about all these things that we're scared of, but all of those things are also true with businesses, but there were fail safes put in place, and that program effectively did its job. And so we need to think about how are we moving resources that quickly into communities in those same ways, and how are we looking at and thinking about Medicaid and SNAP access and housing and other services in these times of need. Also too, making our tax structure more fair, adequate, and having the predictability of predictable. Yeah, sorry. I'm speaking over myself. Make our tax structure more fair, adequate, and predictable by eliminating tax breaks for the wealthy and big corporations, and using part of that revenue to reduce the reliance on sales tax in the state. And so we will have 4 constitutional amendments on the ballot this primary at November 13th. The whole state has the opportunity to vote on these, and we're hoping that folks will turn out, because we're asking you to vote no on 1 and 2, because those 2 particular amendments actually do not make our tax structure more fair, and does preempt local government around sales tax revenue, and moves accountability further away from the voter. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we move through our discussion today. Next slide. I will, we have several guests here with us today. And so I will just briefly say this, but we will definitely get more into it as we engage with our guests. Certainly Andreaneica Morris knows much more about what's happening around with housing through her work with Housing Louisiana. But we just wanted to kind of give you a basis point for when we start the discussion that, there's been $555 million available in rental assistance in Louisiana from the December 2020 COVID relief package and ARPA funding. And the vast majority of those dollars has not made it to communities. And so, how are we going to get this housing money moving? And much to the reference that I just made around PPP, like how do we move these dollars, which is Andreaneica's idea. And I give her credit, but I've said it makes sense, right? Like how do we actually, create processes that actually work and are quick and efficient to address the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. Next slide. So pre-COVID, approximately 66% of Louisiana renters with extremely low incomes were severely cost burdened and at risk of homelessness. And in March, of 2021, this year, there were over 15,600 homeless children in the state of Louisiana. And it's these numbers that I think also drove us to do this second, edition of this recovery roadmap, is that so we've got 555 million in housing dollars, and of which, less than 70 million has been moved in the midst of a housing crisis. And these are the realities of the numbers, that we're dealing with in our state. And I think that also too, this doesn't even take into account and how many more people were then further, put into housing issues or crisis because of Hurricane Ida. Next slide. And so, these slides are reading my mind. The Hurricane Ida, certainly increased that need, and we need to get people help now. People need temporary housing now. We've been working and pushing on FEMA to figure out what are the answers. How do we get people temporary housing? This isn't the first mass storm that we've been through. So, the idea that we're still fighting to try to move, what are the simple and basic necessities while people are sleeping on tents in their property or sleeping in their cars. We've got to make sure that we find solutions, and paying for hotel rooms for individuals and families, and not making it so burdensome where, there was a woman from Laplace that, she's moved 4 hotels and was just telling the story of like how frustrating it is to continuously have to move, based on what's happening with, a hotel's, ability to work with the government. And so, so we definitely need to make that happen. Next slide. Environmental justice. I'm so excited that we'll be hearing from our friend and partner, Sharon Levine, shortly here. And, in environmental justice, it's just real. Like we've got a lot of issues in our state, and a lot of communities that bear the brunt of breathing in toxic levels of carcinogens. We know after Hurricane Ida, there was lots of oil that was moved into our waterways, and so for us, this was an opportunity to think about, we also oftentimes hear industry talk about jobs, but the reality is that when oil and gas really started in Louisiana, they were about 35% of the gross domestic product of the state. They are now, they're less than 5%. So about 4.5% of the gross domestic product of our state. So what it means is that they're still present here. They're still polluting our air. They're still creating, dangerous, health conditions throughout, the areas that they're in, but we're not actually seeing the resources. There aren't actually that many jobs, and there aren't actually that many opportunities where that money is actually staying in our communities and making a difference. And so, what we hope that, again, in terms of thinking about, these resources and thinking outside of the box and stoking some imagination, that this is an opportunity to invest in, clean energy alternatives and job training, and to really kind of build out a climate change workforce that can be responsive in times of disaster, as well as to address the fact that, that we've still got water systems, that are not up to code. And so, and then following, these storms, one of the things that we know is that several communities throughout our state are currently under a boil water advisory. And we've just got to think about infrastructure and the opportunities to make these dollars actually work for our communities. Next slide. And then again, taking action, like this roadmap, again, it's a document that gives you some insight into, like the realities of where we are on many of these issues. But we also, again, want it to be a document of action. This document is for you to use for advocacy purposes. This document is here for you to organize. We know that, each, municipality is taking a different look at this. We know Shreveport's going to be doing some listening sessions, so they can better understand how to use these these dollars to have the most impact on community. We know Baton Rouge is having a series of conversations, but are thinking of these dollars somewhat as a surplus. And so how do we engage at those city council meetings and in other ways to ensure that these dollars actually make it to the ground in our communities in Baton Rouge? And then New Orleans has a task force that's making recommendations around this funding. But again, we know that, municipalities have budget holes and these dollars are, primed to be able to fill some of those holes. But the reality is that there are holes in our community, there are holes in our homes. Like I said, there's insecurity all around us, and we need to also prioritize that as well. And so, so for us, this is about taking action, taking the information that's in here and really asking, our elected leaders at the local and state level to prioritize and center communities. Next slide. So one of the things, it's at powercoalition.org/roadmap. Please check us out and see it there. And I'm excited to move into our panel discussion. Next slide. So let me introduce our panelists today. All of these speakers are deep partners in the work with Power Coalition. They, along with countless others, make up our kitchen cabinet, folks who are a megaphone for justice and equity. They're going to provide a deeper dive into the community data and research to help paint a picture of what Louisiana would look like if we centered its most impacted communities and reimagine what Louisiana could look like with these resources and other resources that we know are coming. And so I want to introduce our panelists. So Andreaneica Morris, Executive Director of HousingNOLA and Housing Louisiana, a 10-year partnership between the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, the Foundation for Louisiana, the city's Office of Housing and Community Development, and dozens of public, private, and nonprofit organizations working to solve New Orleans' affordable housing crisis, as well as addressing housing issues across the state. We also have joining us today Sharon Levine, who is the Executive Director of Rise St. James. And Sharon Levine is a special education teacher turned environmental justice advocate, successfully stopped the construction of a $1.25 billion plastics manufacturing plant alongside the Mississippi River in St. James Parish. In addition to stopping the construction, Sharon has also mobilized grassroots opposition to the project, educated community leaders, and organized peaceful protests to defend her predominantly African-American community from the perils of oil and gas and unregulated oil and gas. And the plant would have generated 1 million pounds of liquid hazardous waste annually in a region already contending with known carcinogens and toxic air pollution. And also, too, she is this year's Goldman Prize winner for her diligent effort on environmental justice for the people of Louisiana, but specifically her community in St. James. We also have Jan Moeller, who's the Executive Director of the Louisiana Budget Project, joining us as well. And Jan is the Director of the Louisiana Budget Project, which monitors and reports on state government spending and how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income families. He is an award-winning journalist. He likes to keep that a secret, but he is an award-winning journalist, formerly with the New Orleans Times-Picayune State Capitol Bureau, which he covered with the state budget, healthcare policy, higher education, and races for Louisiana governor and U.S. Senate. But one thing I will also say to you about the Budget Project is that they have been a deep partner with us in figuring out and telling the story of the lived experience of real people in our state and being able to help our elected leaders connect to that data, right? And so they do these district profiles for our House and our Senate, as well as many clear data pieces that our electeds and community can connect with to be able to make change possible. And so I want to welcome our panel here today. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for always standing with us. Thank you for always fighting for change. And so I'm going to start with my first questions and I'll move through. So Sharon, you have sat on many panels, you and I both. We've cried together, we've fought together, we've organized powerful policies that have stopped giants with more resources than us. When you think about recovery that centers equity and justice for folks you're fighting for in the river parishes, what should that recovery entail? And who's bearing the burden of environmental racism and climate change disasters in our state?
Well, I think that should, they would look at what's going on in each district and assess the damages and the areas that's affected the most and those are the people that need help, especially after Hurricane Ida. I rode around the community and I saw so much devastation. People were crying and asking Rise St. James to help them. We had people to come out and put tarps on roofs on homes. We had people to come and gut homes. And I feel like the government is not paying attention to the low-income people and the people that's affected by industry also, because after Hurricane Ida, I saw more emissions from the industries in St. James. I did live streams about them the day after the hurricane. One industry had an oil spill. They did not report it. The people next to the oil spill called me and told me that there was oil in the ditch near their homes. I did a live stream asking EPA to come out and check on it. Also, I called EPA. They called me back and told me they were going to come and check on it. Then after that, the company made a statement to the public after I reported them to EPA. And then this other industry, American Styrenics, they've been polluting us more and more every day with those flares. I've done live streams on that. I spoke about it. And they seem to take advantage of us while we are down. They have the impression that no one is watching them, but we are watching them. But no one, the parish officials don't address these issues. Parish president don't address these issues. We did not have warnings before the hurricane. Our parish officials did not alert us on what we should do on an evacuation route or anything. And we still don't have an evacuation route in the 5th district where I'm from. And the government is not even trying to see what we need. They're not even contacting us. And the public officials, they have meetings. They had a meeting with the governor, I was told. They don't let us know what's going on. We are in the dark. They don't even tell the citizens of St. James what's going on. They don't ask us what we need. And people come into Rise St. James to ask for help. When a couple of days after the hurricane, an elderly lady came to my home and she said that she don't have ways to go to another district to get ice and water. So she was asking me to help her. And I felt so bad because I didn't know that the parish officials weren't helping the elderly. So we took it on ourselves to help the elderly. We gave them water. We went in our cars. We had people to ride around and give to the people. Then we started to do some giveaways. We did hot meals and whatever we can. And we trying to help the people that's elderly and sickly. We're trying to help them because they need the help so bad. And a lot of them lost their homes. They don't have anywhere to stay. And some of them don't want to go stay in the project, but they can't stay in the project. The project is damaged too. So they need housing. Just like I need housing. But I'm trying to help them first because they were crying when they came to me and they made me cry. So whatever help that I can do with Rise St. James, we are doing it. We do giveaways, give away clothes, we asked them what they needed. We took a list and we got some of the supplies that the people needed and we brought it to their homes. And we had people that, for example, my brother was stuck in his home the day after the hurricane. I called the parish to ask the parish to come and cut the tree across his driveway so he can get out. They said no. They said no, they don't do that on private property. So he had to pay someone to cut the tree so he can move, so he can leave out of his driveway. That was one thing that we didn't know the parish didn't do anymore. There's a long story about why they don't do it because our previous parish president, he did some wrongdoings. And so the whole parish have to suffer because he did something wrong. And I don't think that's right. And so I said, after all this is over with, we want to bring issues up to the parish council members and to change some of these things that are not right. And It's so many things that we need to change, so many things that we need to do because industry is not stepping up to the plate. They gave us tarps. They gave us jambalaya. I told them we don't need these things. We need housing. We need them to step up to the plate and at least fix one person home, at least one. We have 12 industries in the 5th district. If they take one, that would be 12 homes. People are misplaced because they don't have a home to go to.
Yeah.
Like I don't have one to go to either, but I feel for them. They need it worse than I do. I can sleep in my car or whatever, but still in all, they can't do that. They don't have a car. So they need help. It looks like the government is not stepping up to come see about us. And just like we left alone, and industry is polluting us even more since the hurricane. And it's not right. And something needs to be done about all of this. We need to have meetings and work on it and see what we can do. Because they are taking advantage of us while we are down. And I will be speaking in DC on the 13th of October. Fossil fuel versus people. So I'll be out there and I'm hoping, I'm praying I can get to see the president. I know it's wishful thinking, but I'll try.
Oh, for sure. Well, you know what, Ms. Sharon, I never underestimate you, what you can do, and we're all here to work with you to make sure that we can make sure the voices of all of those impacted by Hurricane Ida are heard. You know, we've been talking to FEMA and trying to work with FEMA to to move temporary housing to the state as quickly as possible, and recognize that that's still going to be an issue. But look forward to standing with you and continuing to work with you to make that happen. And so. In fact, our next panelist, Andreaneica may be able to also offer some insight into some of the housing pieces. And so, again, Andreaneica and I have been fighting the housing crisis for years in the state of Louisiana, and we are, now we're beyond crisis. I think it is certainly, it's just an issue that we have to have a real conversation about at a time too, where the state actually does have some resources to be able to address the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. And so, for us, how do we address this housing, crisis that we're in? How do we target our fight for justice? And what are the dragons that we have to slay, Andreaneica, as we think about housing in the state of Louisiana and making it make sense?
Well, thank you, Ashley. Good morning to everyone. And thank you to the Power Coalition for this amazing roadmap, this amazing, unfortunately, incredibly prescient and timely piece. It was on time before Ida. It's even more on time now. So, and I'm thrilled to be in partnership with you all and a part of this. And you asked the question that, drives our work at HousingNOLA, GNOHA, and Housing Louisiana is how do we get to the place where we have a system that guarantees housing? How do we get to the place where we are absolutely making sure that this is a guaranteed item for everyone who needs it? And we're not there yet, clearly. And it's unfortunate that people are learning this the hard way, that this how broken this system is, because now that their homes have been destroyed because of Ida, they are now at the mercy of the same system that people who were struggling, that Ashley talked about earlier, people who were cost burdened before Ida, before COVID, and who all of that got worse. So with COVID and the Delta and Laura and the polar vortex and these successive cascading disasters, that was the environment that Hurricane Ida rolled into. And now we have a wreck on top of an oil spill on top of a nuclear bomb. And the first thing that we have to do is guarantee housing for all of these folks. And it's pretty straightforward and simple. Because of COVID, we have thousands of vacant hotel rooms. Don't let anybody tell you that all the hotel rooms are being used by the linemen. Everybody sees on social media that is not the case. And we also see in the newspaper that the cruise ship that was brought in for the linemen isn't even at 50% capacity. So what is the issue? One of the problems is that when FEMA contracts with hotels to do a disaster program, they pay a fixed rate. And they did this, it took too long, but they did this last year with almost 12,000 evacuees from the Lake Charles area. But then the hotels in New Orleans and the metro area were grateful because we were in the middle of COVID and no one knew when it was going to end. Despite right now, there isn't a lot going on tourism-wise because of the Delta variant, Jazz Fest, French Quarter Fest, Voodoo Fest, all of these opportunities that would have made them money are not happening. So why aren't they welcoming these evacuees, people who are storm damaged? Well, because they think that they can get a better price. And the fact of the matter is the state and our municipalities are going to have to step in, and they should be using the COVID FEMA program, the COVID FEMA hotel program, where the state and the cities and the parish governments can negotiate directly with the hotels, get blocks of rooms for homeless people, which again, unfortunately, people don't like to, and this is one of the things that we've got to talk about. The notion of when I say homeless, the average person thinks about someone on the streets, thinks about a panhandle they pass. If your home has been destroyed because of Hurricane Ida, you are homeless. And that is that's not an accusation on my part. It is a clarification, and I also entreat everyone to recognize how we have othered those souls who are on the street, and that there is very little difference between someone sleeping under a tent, under an overpass, and a tent on their own property. We think that we like to pretend that there is. We like to other the people under the overpass, but it is this failure to create a system that helps them that fails us now. And that's why we've got to embrace a concept of guaranteeing housing for all. Doesn't matter if you're a drug addict, doesn't matter if you're a hardworking person, doesn't matter if you're a child, doesn't matter if you're a healthy, able-bodied individual who is choosing not to work. It does not matter. We all need housing guaranteed all the time, and it needs to be safe, decent, sustainable. It should not be, again, COVID should have taught us that shelters, these are the group shelters, like rec rooms and things like that, we can't do that anymore in living in the now COVID reality, right? Because those are breeding grounds for COVID, right? There's not a lot of, you put 100 people in a rec room, you can try to social distance, or a gymnasium, you can try social distancing, but what if that rec room doesn't have really great air conditioning? So now you're putting people, likely the elderly, in a facility with masks on that they have to keep on all day while they're sweating. And again, there's just a better way. We've got to commit to saying, you don't want to give everybody a McMansion. There's a difference between a home that nurtures and shelters you and an opulent mansion. And it's problematic that we jump to that first, that we jump to the notion that people who were struggling before a disaster should somehow go back to a lesser standard of living than we would accept, than we would expect, that we deserve, because somehow they were less than, and we've got to put that down. So the roadmap to recovery talks about and puts it in stark relief how our failure to address housing has impacted the people we claim to care the most about. Y'all heard Ashley talk about that startling statistic earlier. Almost 16,000 homeless children, and that's homeless by our definition. Homeless either that and what we use as that definition is you don't have your name on a deed or a lease. Because if you don't have your name on a deed or a lease, you don't have control, you don't have authority, you don't have rights. So you are homeless. If you're doubled up with family, if you're staying in a hotel temporarily that you're paying a monthly hotel on, if you're street homeless or you're staying in a shelter, you're homeless. And that is the stats. That's how those 16,000 children, school-age children, were classified earlier this year in the midst of the pandemic. So how easy was it for those kids to do remote learning? How easy was it for those children to show up for school every day? It's remote learning is hard enough when you have a home with internet and a computer in a room of your own. It is nigh impossible under these conditions, and these are the impacts. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Ashley, and I saw a question come in, and I'm gonna chat the answer to it.
Thank you so much, Andreaneica. And then our final panelist, last but not least, is Jan, who we've been talking about We're talking about money. We're talking about, we're talking about both federal and state money. You heard me say it many times before that I knew the federal government would be the only engine big enough to recover our communities. And now, I really feel like the onus is on us to be able to, drive as much of that money to the ground as we can to be able to support communities. And so as we face these compounded disasters, Jan, how much money are we talking about? And how do you think that we can engage with state and local government to advocate to get these dollars to communities?
Thanks, Ashley, and I really appreciate you inviting me on here. And I want to first just give a shout out to the Power Coalition for such an amazing partnership over the years, really from the very beginning. And I want to just plug this roadmap. The Power Coalition did the heavy lifting on putting this together, but it was really truly a collaborative process. And I love being part of the Power Coalition because it's a bunch of organizations truly working together around a common purpose, which is, to center people in communities that are often overlooked in policymaking. And we all come at this from slightly different angles, whether it's environment or housing or criminal legal system reform. But we all have the same ultimate goal, and the Power Coalition is the convener. And so we're so grateful for this partnership, and the roadmap really reflects that collaborative spirit. To answer your question, Ashley, you're exactly right. I mean, the state has to balance its budget every year. And when things like COVID strike or a disaster strikes, it usually means less money coming in and tax revenue and a lot more needs. So we really need the federal government to step up to the plate. And in the past 2 years, year and a half since COVID started, the federal government really has. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I will say, really under Donald Trump's administration, Congress passed several rounds of relief. And then, of course, President Biden, the first big bill he signed was the ARPA law. And so there's been a lot of money coming to Louisiana and other states. For the state and localities alone, it's about $4.8 billion. And that has to be spent over about 2.5 years. To put that in perspective, the entire state general fund for a year is about $9.1 billion. So there's a lot of federal money coming in to help with the recovery. There's about $3 billion of that going to the state, about $1.8 billion for cities, parishes. And there's additional pots of money. This does not include money that's going directly to public schools, directly to childcare, directly to transit and housing. So there's more money coming into the state government from the federal sources than any time since Hurricane Katrina. But as we saw with Katrina, a lot of this money was not used to make kind of lasting systemic change. We used it to sort of paper over problems. And so what we're really thinking about is, it's so critical that these resources get to the people and the communities that need them the most. The big point I want to make here is that even though, ARPA passed in March and some of this money has already been allocated, there is still a lot of time left to influence this because a lot of this money has not yet been spent. The state only allocated about half of its allotment in the current year. The rest of it is sitting in the bank and it's going to be distributed next year. A lot of cities, and we're not tracking the city portion as closely, but these conversations are happening community by community, trying to decide exactly what to do. And there's been, good stories and bad. We were surprised and happy to see that in Shreveport and Lafayette, they're holding community conversations and really holding listening sessions and trying to get public inputs. But other cities have taken kind of a we know best approach, and we're going to try to spend this and rush it through the council. At the state level this past spring, we were very disappointed that a lot of this money was really divvied up behind closed doors without a true citizen input process. And that's how we ended up with about $400 million being used to bail out the unemployment trust fund instead of really taking care of people who are unemployed, which is what we thought the money should have gone to. The good news is we're doing better than Alabama, where the governor just called a special session of the legislature to spend $400 million of their ARPA money on prison construction. So, it could be worse, and I'm glad it's not going into the criminal legal system. But we've been looking around the country for some ideas, because again, when we think about how this money should be spent, we ask a very simple question when anything is proposed, which is, would this use, whatever you're trying to use this money on, and a lot of it's going to, like as Ashley said, filling budget shortfalls. The absolute first rule for this should be to make sure that we are not cutting budgets and cutting services at a time when people need them most. But there's still going to be money left over. And so we're asking the question, before you decide to spend it on infrastructure or to dig a well or fix a water system, is this going to leave communities better off than if you just wrote a check to people who really need money? And here's what we know about writing checks. And I mean, I think writing checks to people sometimes gets a bad rap, but like we said, after COVID started, the federal government really stepped up in an unprecedented way with multiple rounds of stimulus checks, with enhanced federal unemployment benefits, with aid to businesses that allowed them to keep workers on the payroll instead of laying them off. And we saw earlier this month that this really worked. The federal government releases poverty data every September. This year, they didn't have enough data to release state-by-state poverty numbers, but they did release federal poverty numbers. And so what we saw was the official poverty rate actually rose in 2020 by 1 percentage point. But there's a different measure that we like to talk about that I think is more accurate, and it's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, and it looks at poverty after you add in the effect of public programs, whether it's food or housing or cash assistance. The supplemental poverty rate in 2020 actually fell by almost 3 percentage points. So what we learned in 2020 was that in this unprecedented year of economic disruption, when so many people lost their jobs, when so many people had their lives upended by COVID, the actual level of poverty in this country was reduced because the federal government stepped up and put cash in the hands of people when they needed it the most. And so when we think about these stimulus conversations, when we think about these ARPA conversations that are going to be continuing this fall in communities across the state, this winter, and certainly next spring at the legislature, we need to be asking the question of how do we center the communities and the people in those communities that need them most? How do we advance racial equity with these dollars? How do we use that to tear down some of the barriers that have held people back for so long? So I think this is, I'm an optimist by nature, so I think there's great opportunity here in Louisiana to do some good things with this money, but it's only going to happen if people speak up on their own behalf and people tell their elected officials how they want this money to be used. Again, thank you so much to the Power Coalition for leading this conversation. We could not do our work without the base building and the convening and the just amazing work that you put together and in bringing us all together for things like this.
Thanks so much, Jan. And, we certainly appreciate all of our partners. And I think that one of the things that, that I've learned through this experience of this coalition work is that like, if we put our work within a shared frame, we can win more and faster. And that it allows us to take our voices to combine our voices to actually move the needle on the systems that have not changed. And so we are almost at time. And so what I will, so I have a couple of things that I want to share. One, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you guys for joining us. We cannot do our work if we didn't have the deep content knowledge that you have in each of your issue areas that informed this document, but that also informs our advocacy, both at the local and state and federal level. We appreciate you and all that you do to make sure that, we can center folks as much as possible in many of these conversations. And so thank you to you all, Sharon, Jan, and Andreaneica. Also too, please share this report, read this report. We will have hard copies available upon request. We also have a one-click, which is an email service that allows you to reach out to your electeds about sharing this report and asking the question, how are they going to use these funds, and whatever ideas you would like to add to that email. And so you will have access to a one-click. This document will be developed each year because recovery from these disasters will take quite some time, and I think we're not anywhere near where we need to be. And so I think we will continue to do this as we see infrastructure funds, as well as other there's disaster recovery dollars that are coming down as well. Also would be remiss if I did not shout out my team. The Power Coalition team is small but mighty. Definitely want to lift up Georgia, Morgan, and Jen, who does all of our amazing graphics. But thanks to our entire team for making this happen and bringing us together today. And also too, wanted to let folks know, you can go on our website. Additional organizations can certainly sign on. Go to our website at powercoalition.org and pull up the document. And there are lots of places for you to do that. And then I would be remiss if I didn't close without saying that we do have an election on November 13th in the state of Louisiana. There will be 4 constitutional amendments that will be discussed, that will be on that ballot. And if you want to discuss, there will be more information coming out. But certainly, Power Coalition is coming out against Amendment 1 and 2. I know also the Budget Project has also come out against Amendment 2 around the tax swap. Amendment 1 is a preemption bill that preempts, our larger municipalities around their sales tax without a well thought out idea of how they're going to replace the current system. And so, take some time to read those amendments, spend some time with it, but we do need all of you to engage in this election process. Voter registration in person ends on October 13th, voter registration online, October 23rd. And we hope that you'll join us. And I want to thank all of the organizations and speakers here today, and look forward to continuing to work with you to center our communities and address these systemic problems. So thank you for being with us today.
Great job, everyone. Thank you so much.